Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I have a chemistry lesson to share with you. We are working through this chemistry main lesson block by Live Education, and we're working on some of the very first lessons in this main lesson block. So today we're going to be doing the introduction to the subject, and we're going to be doing a watercolor that is mainly the blue color in order to show water and the water cycle in relation to the chemical processes that we're going to be studying in chemistry in the upcoming lessons. For this lesson, I'm using my Fabriano watercolor paper. This is 140-pound paper, so it's quite thick and heavy, and we're going to be including this into our main lesson book rather than working in the main lesson book directly so that we can work with watercolor paper. We're also using our Stockmar watercolors in Prussian blue and ultramarine blue. So I'm going to be mixing those colors up with this, like a little jar and some water. And then we also have our Stockmar watercolors, the pan watercolors, and that's so that we can add a little bit more detail if we want to. And they also have both of those colors right here too as well if you just wanted to do the pans rather than the wet on wet watercolors. But we're kind of excited to do the wet on wet for this particular lesson. I'm going to start by mixing my colors, and I want the colors to be pretty strong and quite saturated. And so I'm going to very carefully use my paintbrush to get some of that concentrated paint and mix it with a little bit of water. We're just going to start with a little bit, and then we can test this out on a piece of paper to see if the color is as saturated as we want it to be. I'm going to do the same with the Prussian blue. I have my jar and another clean paintbrush. Okay, so both colors are really light, and there's a subtle difference between the two colors. So one seems to have a bit more purple and the other one is a bit more blue. And I do want them a touch darker, but to do that, I'm going to use a new paintbrush rather than introducing liquid into my concentrated paints. Oops, too much. So that's not that much darker, so I might just add a little bit more before we get started. Much nicer. So I ended up with about twice as much concentrate as I originally put in order to get this depth of color. Oh, that one's not mixed well. And there isn't necessarily proportions that you use for this. It's whatever strength or saturation you want. That one has some bits that are not completely dissolved in. Okay, so now we're ready to start on our watercolor. These are the main lesson books that we're using that are 9.5 inches by 12 inches, and they have blank pages on the inside. We're going to be adding this paper to our main lesson book, but I do want to round 2 of the corners so that we have a nice even border all the way around. I've got a corner punch here, and it's a small detail that's completely not necessary. Oop, I did that one wrong. But I think it'll add a nice finishing touch to the main lesson book. Okay, so now we can begin. The inspiration for the illustration comes from this illustration on the front cover of the chemistry main lesson book. I'm not going to wet our page by soaking it in water. I'm taking a wet sponge and I'm going to gently add moisture to the top layer. And you can also use a spray bottle to do this as well. And alternatively, you can use your paintbrush and some water to just paint with water. I think this paintbrush had something on it already. And that's if you want to avoid soaking your whole paper. I'm going to do both sides. And I did not take care to clean this area very well. You can already see a little bit of blue. And I'm also not taping down my page because I want the color to run all the way to the edges. And you could also tape it down and then trim off the extra white if you wanted to still have your color run all the way to the edges that way. Okay. Now we can start. And we're going to work at getting blue across the whole page, but I do want it to follow a particular organic shape. And while it's going to be hard to keep white spaces, I do want to attempt to keep some white spaces. This watercolor is very meditative and it seems deceptively easy, but it was a lot more challenging than we expected. And I found that my daughter found it challenging as well. And so one thing that I told her when she felt like she wasn't happy with her final result, I said, that's okay, it's all blue. We can now work on adding layers or removing color. So rather than trying to keep white spaces as I am at the beginning, I realized it was easier to lift the color out once I was done painting. Now I'm using the thinner brush to add some details. And some of the page has already dried, so I can get some additional swirly details in it as well. And then leaving some of the space white. For now, I do want to bring in some of that. It's too stark, so I want to kind of soften that white space a little bit. Our whole watercolor session took about 40 minutes, and it seems like a long time to do watercoloring, but there is also some prep time and setup as well. So there's a few minutes to do that, and then there's the cleanup and waiting for your page to dry. So overall, this is quite an involved lesson, and it seems really simple, but you actually gain a lot from this. Now, for some people, this is quite a meditative process, and for others, it requires a lot of effort and will in order to do something like this. At this point, I really like the way that it looks, but I couldn't see that I liked it until I was done and I'm reflecting on it. So I like the way that the watercolor looks in the end, but you can stop before you think you're done. And this is something that I have yet to learn in all of my years of homeschooling and doing our art projects and our watercoloring especially. It's really hard for me to know when to stop. At this point, I'm wetting my watercolor brush, removing the excess water, and then lifting the color out of the page. And you can do this when you use a really thick, heavy watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound watercolor paper. So it can really take this kind of wetness and this work with your paintbrush. I am being delicate, but still, if you were using a lighter weight watercolor paper or not watercolor paper, you certainly wouldn't be able to do this. So this allows you to lay down some paint. Even if you painted all in blue and then just lifted the color, you would be able to do this. And this gave my daughter a little flexibility because she wasn't happy when she got towards the end. And I said, that's okay. You can do swirls by lifting the color out. So once I showed her how to do that, she was able to lift some of the color out. But unless your page is getting closer to dry, that other color is just going to come in and take that place. So you might have to go over it several times in order to really lift the color out and let it dry that way as well. So this is only half of our lesson. We still have to do the written portion for this lesson. Once this page dries completely, we'll paste it into our main lesson book and start on our written portion. I used some double stick tape to paste it into the main lesson book. And then before I started with the written portion, I decided to use the onion skin to do one more drawing, this time with color pencils and some crayons. And this is completely unnecessary, and I realized that after the fact, I probably should have used that onion skin to continue the writing portion of this lesson because we were only able to get through barely 2 of the 3 chemical processes that were introduced in this lesson. After this quick illustration, I titled this page "The Chemical Processes," and then we wrote out in a narration form the chemical processes that were introduced in lesson number 1. I really love the story-driven, imaginative way that this lesson introduced the chemical processes by first going through a volcano, a candle, and our digestion, bringing in lessons that were previously covered in the mineralogy main lesson block from the previous year, as well as a little bit of botany and zoology from previous main lesson blocks. But primarily, the mineralogy block was really covered in this first lesson when we went through the chemical processes of combustion first, followed by the salt formation process through precipitation when we talked about the limestone cycle. So for lesson 1, we ended up spending 3 days to review some of the things that we had studied in our mineralogy block so that those concepts were revisited, were fresh, and were solid before moving on with this chemistry main lesson block. So once I was done writing this narration, I wanted to go back and highlight a few of the words that were part of the processes so that my daughter could see that these were, in essence, the topics that were going to be discussed during this main lesson block, at least for the first portion of these lessons. So this is what the 2-page spread looks like with the chemical processes on one side, and we didn't even finish. We have one more chemical process we're going to have to fit on another page, along with that illustration on this page, as well as the watercolor on the next page, which I really like the way it turned out in the end, even though that was a really long, unexpected process. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our first chemistry lesson for our Waldorf chemistry main lesson block. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information, as well as links to all of the resources we're using for this main lesson block. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.